Hello and welcome to my very delayed commentary on your Google Hangout One. And I do apologize, I typically don't hold on to your stuff for so long, but somehow I had a mysterious disappearance of my notes on your, in my household on your Google Hangout One. So I had to wait and watch it again. In order to give you my comments. So fortunately, your second one is not due until next week. So hopefully some of my comments on your Hangout you can integrate into the second one. So first of all, I wanted to start by thanking Kennedy for doing the facilitation on the first one. It's always really difficult to do the first one because you need to clean out all those technical issues and all the glitches and setup and stuff like that. So really well done on that. I did like the depth of your discussions and turn taking and coverage of the points in the Hangout. So just keep doing what you did on the first one. The camera work was good, so I was able to see the people that were actually speaking, and you moved the camera from the person that was finished to the next person that was speaking, so that was very good as well. One of the things to think about enhancing in your Hangout was I had a really hard time hearing when Dalia was speaking or when Dalia was doing anything. And I know that Dalia had some issues with connectivity in Mexico City, but I think it was something more technical on your end to do with your mic or to do with your headphones, because I had a lot of static of your movements. It was picking up a lot of the notes and stuff. There was just a lot of echoing on everything that you were doing. So I would try to go back to the Hangout if you might, or try to figure out what went in the first one, so you can eliminate those interferences in the second one, because it's hard to focus when you have all that ambient noise. And sometimes it's technical issues with the internet, but I think that was more of a mechanical stuff. And the other thing is I had a little bit of the sense that you had pauses or a little bit of a dead time in between the answers to questions. So I would try to have a very clear idea in what sequence you're going to go and who is going to answer what or tackle what first, so you don't have that dead time, so you get a better flow. But generally, it was a very good discussion. I enjoyed it. So number one, you started with talking about the differences between civil defense and civil protection, and clearly distinguishing the defense as being all those actions taken by the federal government during the wartime effort to protect during the wartime effort. That's pretty much the most important distinction. It is the civil defense is it is not directed as the sources or hazards, events that are hazardous to the public if they are natural, technological. It certainly has to do with security. So not safety as much as security. So intentional acts. And in the case, of course, war, it's from external enemies, not necessarily within a domestic environment. So that's been sort of a historical basis for civil defense. And I'll tell you one more thing. Civil defense originated in the United States during the administration of President Woodrow Wilson. And the first entity for national civil defense was created by him in 1916. And basically, this was the first war conflict that was international that the new country, United States, took part in. We had Monroe Doctrine. We didn't get involved with, international conflicts. And certainly World War I was this very first time where this young country was playing on the international arena. And President Wilson Wilson wanted this to be quite a significant accomplishment. So he was very, very focused on the war effort and the war propaganda and supporting the war at the local levels. And how do you do that? Well, federal government doesn't have a presence at the local level, right? So when he created that first National Defense Committee, he made sure that the states mirrored creation of the state committees, and then the local committees were formed. There were civil defense, civil defense committees, CDCs, and he would then send representatives from the federal government, mostly military members, to sort of go down to those localities and to do what? Well, A, disseminate information on war propaganda. Because that was very critical to reach those households. You know, how do you encourage a mother to send a child to die in Spain or France or wherever this atrocious front was? And so you've got to get down to the local levels. And number two is to safeguard the infrastructure for continued war efforts. So if we were to experience an attack from the enemy in the United States, which, you know, did not happen at the time, but it was a threat because of our involvement, then what kind of critical infrastructures would we need, and how would we make sure that there are people working there, there are people still propelling that national war effort? So let's say something happens to a vast number of people in the area, and 2,000 of them work for this munition factory. Well, you need to have housing for them, you need to have medical care for them, you need to have capacities built for them so they can support federal war effort. So it wasn't as much about protecting the public as it was to making sure that you protect federal interest, and the public was part of them. But that came from the war effort. Concurrently, if you recall from Reuben reading, 19 was a critical time when the Spanish flu hit. And John, somewhere in your session, you discuss the Quarantelli thing about public health emergencies or crises. And environmental crises, and as being different than conflict crises. And certainly Wilson was not in the least interested to offer any support, any federal support, or any federal intervention to the public health emergency. First of all, by not acknowledging it, because it was the security and the national defense that was critical, whereas health hazards and things like that, civil protection, that was more to the localities and the states. And certainly, you know, the highest authority would be the state governor and the state board of public health that would be in charge of it. And those things were starting, but they were not very robust as far as capacities. So from the very beginning, from the Wilson administration, you see a very clear separation of how we look from the responsibility of federal government at what we're responsible for as far as security issues and national defense, but not necessarily protection from those other things. And that's sort of where that very, very strong separation started. Now, the first committee for the national defense body, legislature, did not last. It was dissolved in 1921, but it certainly was the first focus on how the government viewed its role at the local level, mostly in the civil defense, but not necessarily civil protection. So that's, you know, a little bit of a historical background to that. So you discussed, you know, you disentangled that. Crystal mentioned that, you know, this is this distinction between military versus non-military, and it's true. So military effort versus non-military effort. So if you've got war, that's a military effort, that's a civil defense. If you have public, mostly non-security issues, safety issues, you know, the hurricanes, natural, technological, then you have that non-military function. Now, this takes us into the civil protection when you talked about internationally, right? And how the civil protection is a little bit different. Civil protection looks at hazards in addition to threats. So in addition to external threats, such as nuclear war in a Cold War era, or hostile attacks, maybe during First World War that were feared, we suddenly have hazards and ecological stuff and public health and pandemics and stuff like that. This is where the civil protection comes in. And the interesting thing is that in other countries, and you mentioned, I think John mentioned Africa and Asia, and the military has a very strong presence in civil protection in a lot of countries, not in the United States, certainly, because of capacities non-existing otherwise in other agencies at local levels. So the military takes a very large portion because of the way they are logistically equipped, and because militaries are typically centralized. So you have one military and it operates the same way across the country. So whether you have something that needs organization and management in this part or in that part, military can do it very well, whereas separate different agencies don't have that capabilities. Not so in the United States, because remember, and Kennedy, I think, mentioned the difference between when is the National Guard a resource for the civil defense, and when is the National Guard the resource for civil protection, is whether they are military or non-military. And that has to do with Posse Comitatus Act. So the Posse Comitatus Act, in a nutshell, limits the engagement of the military in domestic incident management, in domestic law enforcement, in domestic anything. The military is pretty much for the war effort, for the external attack, so to speak, or external engagement. And then, of course, protection of the assets that drive that security issue that is a national security policy issue. So again, other countries don't have that necessarily, or many other countries. I originally come from Poland, and in Poland, fire services and military work together in floods and in controlling of the public. So military had a very direct interaction with the members of the public during those natural disasters. So very, very strong civil protection function of the military. But because of the United States Constitution and the history, that was a very, very clear separation of, and that act guaranteed that military did not engage civilian population outside of the war conflict, so not in events that were the protection events. However, other countries have that model and use it because that's how they build capacity. I think that Dalia mentioned La Marina. I am not really very well versed in Mexico emergency response mechanisms to earthquakes and stuff like that. But you mentioned that there is a military component that supports law enforcement in disasters or in civil protection. Something that's not typically practiced in the United States. When we have our military, typically goes and deploys for humanitarian aid to other countries, because certainly when they go to other countries, they are not bound by our laws, right? So they can engage with the civilians or public in other areas. But they cannot really enforce a lot of stuff. Our military cannot. So then you discuss some of the characteristics of civil protection. Certainly major government responsibility today necessarily wasn't like that in 1940s or 1920s, but it is becoming a huge responsibility. So for a variety of different reasons, part of them being that we no longer have traditional external threats of, going to war face-to-face with another country, right? Especially since the fall of the Cold War, end of the Cold War, our threats are a little bit different. So that shift in thinking also changed. heterogeneous environments, complex environments, globalization, certainly. John mentioned the Santa Fe shooting and a scene of the multi-jurisdictional event that happened within a very small jurisdiction, right? So you have the area and the local police agency that had the jurisdiction over it. And you mentioned that 5 officers were, including the chief and the assistant chief of the police department, were involved in that event or in the shooting. So when you had response and 500 different officers and a lot of them self-dispatched, you had issues of management because the leadership wasn't part of the management initially. And that goes to the issue of establishing the command, all those features of standardized emergency management. So the unity of command, the staging areas, the establishing of the hot zone, the control and credentialing of people that get in, setting up the staging, setting up the base, setting up the communication protocols, and setting up who is operationally responsible, or having unified command with one operations section chief, and all those things that the ICS teaches. And so it is my feeling that from John, from what you are mentioning, is that they did not use incident command system because the premise of incident command system is the person that is there is the incident commander. So if your chief is somewhere, then your chief is not the incident commander. Obviously, it's a person that can assess the situation and can make those decisions that's there until the transfer of command takes place. You had a little bit of a discussion again on the conflict and military. So public protection, not being conflict in military, but things like health, society, public health. And that's linkage to Wilson that I made, that, in 1918, certainly we did not consider pandemics as a reason for federal government to get involved, to the point of being very nonchalant, because Wilson actually said that those people, those soldiers that died from the flu on those ships going to Europe, they would have given a service to the country to contribute to the war effort. So because he was not willing to dedicate resources, he needed nurses and he needed doctors and stuff like that to tend to the wounded and not to the people that were getting sick in the United States. So good conversation on that, great points on the all those different countries in Africa and Asia that have a different model of civil protection and rely a lot more on government, certainly on centralized government, to provide that civil protection, because capabilities don't. There is no, in a lot of those countries, you've got to think that there's not a lot of self-governance at the local level. So as much as it is here. All hazards. Okay, so Crystal mentioned that perhaps the all hazards, you don't need the same resources for the different types of threats and hazards, especially, if you look at Quarantelli, you would argue that there is a different management of the event that is the conflict crisis versus consensus crisis, so those disaster, natural type of events. Although, it's a big loss that Quarantelli died. He probably would have had some revisions to his earlier take on classification of hazards, because, those things have changed and research has changed. But you all agreed that the functional areas remain similar. So when you have hazard-specific planning, so you plan for that specific type of hazard, that creates so much duplication of effort and rule fragmentation on focus on very small details in plans that might not be used. They sit on the shelf and might be outdated when the crisis actually happens. So instead of that, the all hazard says, well, let's look at capabilities that we need to build that are going to be the same ones that are going to be needed, regardless of whether it is a shooting, a hurricane, And there are those capabilities such as people will leave a certain area en masse. So you need to direct them somewhere, you need to shelter them, or you need to give them medical attention. Whether it was a tornado that ripped through town and they are injured, or if it was a shooting and they are injured, you need mass triage. You need triage and transport, and you need triage and transport and treatment. So you need a medical capacity. You need your hospitals, and you need to know how those hospitals are training and integrating with local emergency response. So medical capacity is one of those that it doesn't matter what happens, you need to build it. Another capacity is sheltering. You know, people need to be somewhere once the bad thing goes through. And of course, you know, in events like shooting or something like that, you don't have the housing issue as much, but you will if you have destruction of properties, right? So maybe not with shooting, but with the explosive device, you might. So those capacities need to be built, and those capacities are very similar across the board. And you are right that the all hazards, and I think John said it very well at the end, that all hazard has all the resemblance of the dual use. Because what happened with dual use? Well, you are fearing a nuclear attack, so you are building shelters for nuclear fallout. Well, what do you have? You have a flood, so you can use the shelters because you don't have a nuclear fallout, but you have people that are displaced. So both events will displace people, so now you've had that shelter regardless that it was built for a different purpose. You have a siren. You have a public warning system that you can blast out information to people in XYZ mile radius. Well, wherever you do have it for, you know, approaching airplanes that are going to drop something, or wherever you use it for the tornado, it doesn't matter. You have a communication system that you've created. It's a capability, it's a capacity. So if we start looking at those things this way, you know, we have all hazard approach. This is a birth, dual use is a birth of all hazard approach, except unfortunately during the Cold War, that dual use wasn't operationalized legislatively. So, you know, those strands of defense and protection did not meet. They were going, you know, sort of parallel. And John, you're right, it wasn't until 9/11, but when we realized that, oh, you know, we can merge that approach. We can merge this. We can use both. You know, we can look at what FEMA's always done, and we can look at what military has always done with, you know, attacks and things like that. We can sort of merge and look at those capabilities jointly, what we need to develop. So because the hazard source or threat source doesn't matter that much. It matters what's going to happen to people, to resources, to communications, to the management structures, so to speak. So then your conversation went into the disciplines of emergency management, or what is called as an emergency management cycle. I want to bring your attention to one little thing that I always like to underscore is when you have all hazard, that whole planning and preparedness thing's a little bit different for safety versus security issues. So mitigation certainly is, I would call mitigation the bedrock of emergency management. It's a starting point. A lot of people tend to think that preparedness and planning is that departure point, but it's truly the mitigation is, and the mitigation is not necessarily what you said about, it's that too, but it's not necessarily about lessening an impact of a disaster after it happens, but it's more about thinking about how we create disasters. Because disasters, Drabek says, is a social thing. It is a failure of a system to do something socially, at the social level. So the land use, the building in the areas we shouldn't be building, so the building codes, the distribution of populations based on income in certain vulnerable areas, So concentrations of certain infrastructures in certain vulnerable areas. The drive of people, to build a house in Galveston on the coast in the area where it is going to be vulnerable is an example of how people don't mitigate, right? The building of a house on a mountain in Colorado where, the wildfires are common. If you decide to build that house and use that land and be in the middle of a forest because you spent 20 years in New York in a very busy city and you just now want to be in the nature, you have to think about how to mitigate living with the threat of a fire. And that has to do with cutting out trees and creating zones and making sure what you plant around, you don't have juniper that burns, but you put, linden, aspen trees that are the largest living organism on Earth and that retain moisture and create that barrier for the wildfire. So that's mitigation. Mitigation also draws very heavily from what Crystal discussed, which was lessons learned and best practices. And certainly our after action reports, or what's being compiled after an event, is a repository of everything that we can integrate into the mitigation processes. Unfortunately, if you look at the history of emergency management, sometimes those lessons learned, I call them lessons observed, because they are truly not learned. Case in point, Allison tropical storm 2001, Texas Medical Center has generators in a basement. Lessons learned: don't put your generators in a basement. So you would think that in a mitigation efforts, entities such as hospitals and other critical infrastructures would not put generators in low-lying areas. Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant reactor, if you recall, that is where the generators were in the low-lying areas and could not be used to cool those rods. Fast forward, Hurricane Harvey, and we have generators in Bent Out that are in low-lying areas and get flooded. So is it best practices learned? Do we mitigate? Mitigation is a very, very difficult part, and particularly because it has to do with business. It has to do with land developers. It has to do with lobbies. It has to do with politics. So we tend to pay a little bit less attention to it. And John, you're right that FEMA is very, very involved in mitigation programs, but federal DHS itself cannot do everything. A lot of that has to do with funding and corporate and private businesses that are part of it, private-public partnership. So that's as far as mitigation. I would leave it at that. We changing our thinking to where what we call naturally caused disasters, we now start calling man-caused disasters because of lack of proper mitigation practices. Now, but the difference that I wanted to talk about is the difference between planning and preparedness and prevention and protection. Typically, you hear prevent, protect mission area when you're talking about management. You hear it with security, so you hear it with threats. So when you have an issue that is intentional, so, your active shooters, your terrorist attacks and stuff like that, we tend to talk in that planning and preparedness phase, we talk about preventing and protecting. So we try to prevent intentional events, and we are trying to protect people from them or infrastructure from them by hardening the infrastructure, by making people more aware. When we speak about safety issues, so your natural and technological stuff, we're talking about planning and preparedness, because the understanding is that we don't have control over those, so we are planning and preparing for how to respond, because we can't prevent natural tornadoes from occurring. So that first part, planning, preparedness, and preventing and protecting, differs a little bit based whether you have a threat or a hazard. But then, of course, you have response, then you have recovery, then you have mitigation, and those disciplines or those cycle parts are similar regardless of the hazard. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. A recovery, I think John was talking about how you are mostly in that planning, preparedness, and response area with your job, not necessarily in the recovery, and definitely probably not in mitigation, because that's really not very much of a law enforcement job, right? To mitigate against disasters or events, you know, at the larger social level. So then you had a little bit of an interesting discussion on plans and planning, and I think Dalia had an issue with the fact that planning might not be management. And I think that the important thing here that Kennedy was trying to capture is with unpredictability, there comes with unpredictability, there is an issue of, you know, plans are nothing, because I think John said that no plan survives the first contact. So we cannot possibly come up with a scenario that's going to happen, right? There is unpredictability of those events, all hazard, you know, whether they are planned and premeditated or whether they happen or occur naturally, they're always going to happen at unprecedented, unanticipated, at the most unpleasant moment, right? So they have all the uns. So there's a lot of unpredictability to that risk. And so the planning process, you know, perhaps is about something different. And again, it's planning process. It's not about plans as much. Management is not about plans or creating plans. It's about thinking about capabilities, you know, something that I mentioned, you know, you create capabilities, you start thinking about that. And the perfect example, I think Kennedy talked about 1993 and the fact that, you know, $100 million was invested in, you know, by the operator of the World Trade Center to improve all the safety features, and still it was the lack of going through all the exercises all the way that, you know, was caused some people to not be aware that the rooftop rescues were not feasible or not part of a plan and stuff like that. So even though there was a plan, it wasn't disseminated, it wasn't communicated. Some of the capabilities were improved, some of the capabilities were not. And John, you mentioned there's this very famous picture from 1993 response. If you Google it, you'll see the 1993 response, and you have, I'm sorry, those are my dogs. And you have all the response vehicles, the fire trucks, the ambulances, you know, on top of one another. I mean, that ambulance cannot take anybody to a hospital in 1993. And I think that picture might be the one on your syllabus. So certainly, you know, self-dispatching, no good incident command post, and people making decisions being in the middle of all that mess, that certainly wasn't, was repeated in 9/11 for a variety of different issues. But again, no plan survives the first contact. I really like that. Preparedness and disaster mitigation have the limits, as Kennedy said, but what we are doing is we are creating capabilities. So I think that the Dalia, maybe the issue you had with that planning is managing, perhaps planning is part of the whole management process, you know, all the management thought people that put forth coordinating, planning, organizing, and so on. But it's the plans that are not really the critical part of it. Is a process that's critical part of being part of management. National Guard. When is it what? I think you flashed it out pretty much. I want to make sure that there is no confusion on this federalized under 32 and under 10. So basically, when the command, Title 10 is when the governor of a state is no longer the commander of the National Guard as a state resource or federal resource. So that would be Title 32. So National Guard, I think Crystal said, could be military or non-military. When it's military, so when it's under Title 10, it is not used for civil protection. It's used for civil defense. It's used for war. When it is federalized by the president to protect federal interests, but within the domestic concept, it is not posse comitatus. It is still used kind of like law enforcement. So they still have law enforcement. They are not bound by posse comitatus. This is very important. And why is it important? Because in Katrina, neither the governor of a state, nor the city mayor, or the concerned elected officials knew to what extent National Guard performed what function. There's a lot of confusion with that, and also that trickled into the media and into those issues with National Guard implementing curfew or considering curfew, and how the National Guard can or cannot implement curfew. And of course, if they are part of the military, they can't do that and they can't enforce it. But if they are part of the resource of the governor, they can. And so there's a lot of misconception in the media, I think, on the role of the National Guard. So it's important to know the difference. It's important to know that the governor can use it for public unrest, for civil protests and stuff like that. And it might look like they are military by the equipment they use and by the way they dress and by the way they are trained, but they are truly kind of like local law enforcement. They are, so to speak, a peace officer in that state that can implement or enforce laws if they are under the command of the governor, or under the command of the governor, but federalized for the use of the president for some domestic issues. So that was really, really important. Another discussion you had was about what was the significance of 1950 Disaster Relief Act. I think you flashed it out very well. This was the beginning of a federal engagement in support to local jurisdictions through cutting out Congress out of very for cutting out bureaucracy and giving a president the say in the federal aid given to jurisdictions quickly when they needed it. So very, very important piece of legislation. This is a foundation of all the other legislations that you talk about, like Stafford Act and expansion of Stafford Act and all the powers of the president with respect to critical incidents in the United States, to involve most recent discussions. So, so very, very important piece of legislation. And note that the 1950 Disaster Relief Act was concurrent with 1950 National Defense Act, but the two dealt with two separate issues. So one was looking at federal government saying, okay, we need to cut the red tape a little bit more in support of federal government to the states and to the affected jurisdictions. On the other hand, the federal government said, oh, we need to have a very strong investment in building capabilities for national defense because of the Cold War, building those shelters and those systems and stuff like that. So the two, the threats and the hazards, or the foreign threat and the domestic issues, so the protection and the defense, followed since the 50s parallel routes. And as I said, it's in 9/11 when they sort of crossed, and that's where we started having, a true integrated approach to that. Discussion followed on events and developments of increasing federal support from the federal government through the focusing events of the 50s and the 60s. Specifically, you talked about the Alaska earthquake and Hurricane Betsy, and you had some really, really interesting conversations on, particularly on the damage assessment and flood insurance. Of course, flood insurance coming out from the Hurricane Betsy, the National Flood Insurance Act is very, very important. Hurricane Relief Act, a lot of different legislative pieces. John mentioned the role of the senator, so involvement of Congress, being a liaison to affected jurisdictions. You might say perhaps that it was a sort of a beginning of a principal federal official that assists with emergency management to states, kind of sort of like principal federal official today at the Department of Homeland Security, perhaps in a way. Also greater involvement of the president to actually being personally involved with viewing the effects of a disaster, and also streamlining federal, state, and local processes for recovery, and aligning those processes. This is those are the beginnings of this collaboration of a tiered system, right? That we're talking National Incident Management System, the federal, the state, the regional, the local, the tribal. So you start seeing that emerging in the 60s. Also, you had really good conversations on I think John mentioned Ike, and how there were issues of assessing the source of the hazard for insurance purposes and for damage assessment. That's still a problematic area, right, for insurance companies, but federal government started having a little bit more oversight over that, and of course subsidizing certain personal loans and unemployment acts and things like that all started emerging in the 60s. I'm glad that at that point you double checked that somebody was recording the session. Talking about creation of or Carter administration contribution to emergency management, obviously it was huge. And certainly taking all those different capabilities at the federal government and merging them into one agency was huge. So taking it out of HUD, Commerce, environmental agencies, and so on and so forth, and creating Federal Emergency Management Agency. That's where we have official start of formal emergency management from the federal level down to the local level, and leveraging all those years of building up to it. Cabinet level department, I think really good points made by John when it gets back to 9/11 and creation of a Department of Homeland Security. FEMA lost that privilege and lost that access. If you think about some really important people in the FEMA history, James DeWitt comes to mind. He was a FEMA administrator during the presidency of Bill Clinton, had a very good relationship with Bill Clinton, was able to do a lot of stuff in mitigation, in creating a good culture of preparedness in FEMA, in fostering really good organizational leadership and stuff like that, because he had that direct access to the president and good relationship, because direct access doesn't always mean that you have a good relationship and you're going to be effective. Because the personalities are still at play, but certainly removing that and creating bureaucracy through Secretary of Homeland Security, to which now the Director of FEMA had to report to, created a lot of issues. And some say that Michael Brown was thrown under the bus in Katrina, and some say that he was totally incompetent to be doing the job he was doing. But it was by the way that most of the people in FEMA before that were professional emergency managers, where he was a totally different appointment because of the Department of Homeland Security being created. So you talked to Kennedy, I think, summed up the era of the 60s as increased funding, federal funds and government funds to support efforts in civil protection. So not civil defense, but civil protection. And you sort of circled back to the dual use and how civil defense capabilities that they grew could be used for natural disasters. And I'll tell you something, I will circle back to President Wilson, because when the epidemic became catastrophic in the United States and scores of people were dying, this is when the civil defense centers were used to start disseminating information to local public on distancing, on measures to take, protective measures, the cough, the masks and all that, the spread of a disease. It was very late. It was, in a second wave of a flu. It was way too late. But that capacity, even at that time, was used. The war was pretty much over in 1918. So even though there was a priority for Wilson, it was pretty much over. And the outcome of the war was decided by the time the flu truly hit. So that centers for defense, the civil defense centers, were critical, working with Red Cross, with local health clinics, with local businesses on disseminating information. So they switched from disseminating information for war and propaganda into flyers and public awareness literature and stuff, because they had that capability already. That's what they were doing for several years, at least 2 or 3 years before that. So that's, kind of illustration of this dual use. And last but not least is the illusion of preparedness during the nuclear war era. Certainly, I think John put it really well, where you talked about people fear. And truly people were scared of the nuclear threat. So those programs and those kind of adjustments, whether they were realistic or not, gave them some sense of agency or created some illusion that they would be able in control if something like that happened. Or as Crystal said it, I'd much rather know something and do some measures where it leaks, but you're still inside, even if it's not impervious, it's still better than nothing. And so I think that's the interesting take on that. But that, when you talk about research, and all the research to date indicates that people do not prepare for disasters. And John, you said that, people will do it at the very last moment. And so the research tells us people don't. And yet those federal agencies so desperately want people to do that. But it's against human social fabric to prepare for disasters, because there are other things that people do. They live, right? So every day they will not have $200 to invest in a bunker, or, they're not going to dig up through the yard, because on any given day, they might not even feel like cutting the grass on Saturday for a lot of households, right? And, I'll do it once a month. So bringing preparedness and shoving it as a responsibility of the public is a strategy of the government to take and spread this responsibility for civil protection in some ways. But then you can also say that it assuages maybe some concerns or some fears people might have, or directs people to think about other things. So even though maybe that radio is not going to be useful for you, and that make the disaster kit, because maybe nobody uses this kind of radios or don't have them, so because they use cell phone. But thinking about making that go bag, or the bag that Dalia was talking about, makes you think mentally, getting prepared that there's eventuality of evacuating. Where are you going to go? How far are you going to run? You're going to stand by the wall during evacuation. That's a big problem with all the evacuation drills. One of you mentioned that. I see it all the time. We have been doing fire drills for dozens and dozens of years, and yet, even at SAM, at San Francisco State University, there's a fire drill. Everybody gets out of the building and stands by the wall. So, we still don't have that mental model of we always have to evacuate to somewhere. There's got to be that capability built, and it should be free of them. We should evacuate to here or to here or to here, because you got to plan 3 deep. So anyway, I think that was very interesting. Crystal said that she didn't know about the nuclear threat and wasn't even aware what that thing looked like, and it makes me feel that I actually lived those times. And we had nuclear sheltering preparations in school because, obviously I grew up behind the Iron Curtain, and we were preparing for the Russians to, launch. And I remember from my civic defense classes, we had civil defense classes, kind of like Israel does on a regular basis. And so we were preparing for enemy attacks. And I remember we always laughed about it because, we found those, even as kids, to be utterly unrealistic to the common mind. So, as far as fixes, those kids are not fixes for anything. But perhaps, like you said, they make people think about the issues. So I think that's pretty much all I've got for your team as far as, going through the commentary and, pulling out all those different threads that you discussed. And so I enjoyed your presentation. Again, my bad on talking to you very late about that. Probably, you forgot about those topics. Hopefully it's a good refresher for you. I'm looking forward to your second Google Hangout that is due next Saturday. And happy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. Bye.